Lecture 12, Part 1, War and Terrorism. In this lecture, we will discuss war and terrorism, two terrible occurrences that happen frequently and are occurring between political states and within them. In the first section, we will focus our attention on war. Then, in the second section, we will shift our focus to terrorism. The noted American writer Mark Twain well describes a propensity towards war. And he states this, and I quote, "Of all the animals, man is the only one that is cruel. He is the only one that inflicts pain for the pleasure of doing it. It is a trait that is not known to the higher animals. The cat plays with the frightened mouse, but she has this excuse, that she does not know that the mouse is suffering. The cat is moderate, unhumanly moderate. She only scares the mouse, she does not hurt it. She doesn't dig out its eyes or tear its skin or drive splinters under its nails man fashion. What she is doing, playing with it, when she's done playing with it, she makes a sudden meal of it and puts it out of its trouble. Man is the cruel animal, he alone in that distinction. The higher animals engage in individual fights, but never in organized masses. Man is the only animal that deals in that atrocity of atrocities, war. He's the only one that gathers his brethren about him and goes forth in cold blood and calm pulse to exterminate his kind. He is the only animal that for sordid wages will march out and help to slaughter strangers of his own species who have done him no harm and with whom he has no quarrel. And in the intervals between campaigns, he washes the blood off his hands and works for the universal brotherhood of man with his mouth." Why do we wage war so often? Catholics locate the answer in our fallen human nature, that although wounded by original and personal sin, is not completely perverse. Other explanations reject this Catholic approach. We will discuss three: Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, and Thomas Malthus's. An unnatural tendency to war. Catholics believe humanity's propensity towards war is due to being fallen sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve's sin affected all their descendants, starting with their sons Cain and Abel. Cain's murder of his brother has been repeated in varying ways throughout history. Because we also are affected by original sin, we too have this unnatural, violent, sinful tendency. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church's teaching on original sin, wars result when human beings act upon a sinful tendency residing in their hearts and minds. According to the Catholic faith, wars are not inevitable. Wars are unnatural. Why is it important to state wars are unnatural? Because our common tendency to sin does not define human nature. Our human natures are essentially reflections of the image and likeness of the triune God, where difference is a cause for greater unity and not disunity. The Son does not want to wage war with the Father and the Holy Spirit. Rather, the unity of God is defined by the love of the Father for his beloved Son in their shared love of the Holy Spirit. Unfortunately, even though at our core we want to live harmoniously and we have the capacities to see difference not as necessarily a cause for war, we do not follow this essential defining trait of what it means to be human. Instead, we, more often than not, identify our natures with our sinful tendencies and not with being made in the image and likeness of God. When we recognize that these sinful tendencies are not who we truly are, it is then more likely that we will strive to reflect God more and more by embracing his healing grace, growing in virtue, and avoiding war. A natural tendency to war. According to the English political theorist Thomas Hobbes, war is not an unnatural tendency of human beings, but is instead essentially natural. The phrase describing man as man's inhumanity to man, describing war as man's inhumanity to man, Hobbes would have rejected. Why? Because Hobbes believed war defines man's humanity to man. For Hobbes, war is man's humanity to man. For Hobbes, peace is what is artificial. Peace, he argues, results when human beings, out of self-interest and fear, choose to be less human. And this is what Hobbes states. I quote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. For war consists not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war. It is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lies not in a shower or two of rain, but an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there's no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace. And he continues, there's a famous, and I invite you to look at the longer excerpt, but there's another famous excerpt which is right here, which is, no arts, in such a condition there is no place of industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, and this is before men give their freedom to a monarch, who then keeps them from killing and robbing and doing all sorts of terrible things to each other. So in that state, no navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious buildings, no instruments of moving and removing such things that require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And then he defines man's natural state is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, where every man is against every man. Scarce resources are the cause of war. According to the Englishman Thomas Malthus, he lived 1766, died in 1834, war is a natural result of competition for scarce resources, in particular food. He assumed that food can be produced only up to a limit. When human beings increase, the human population increases beyond a sustainable limit, determined by how much food can be produced, wars will naturally occur. Malthus made an obvious error, though. He did not consider human beings' ingenuity to invent new ways to produce more food with fewer resources in a shorter space of time. Civilization is the cause of war, not human nature. The Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's also considered the philosopher of the French Revolution, Rousseau maintained that war is a result of advanced civilization which he understood as unnatural. According to him, there are three stages in human history: the stage of the brute animal, the stage of the savage, and the stage of decadent civilization. Rousseau asserted that the stage of the savage is the ideal natural state in which there was no private property and consequently no war. In praising the savage state, he writes in his discourse on the origin of inequality, quote, "Nothing is so gentle as man in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the fatal enlightenment of civil man." When human beings, though, began to own private property, they entered into the violent stage of decadent civilization, at least as presented by Rousseau. And in approvingly describing this civilized phase of history, Rousseau writes the following, I quote, "The first man who, are enclosing a piece of ground, took it in his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simply enough to believe him that man was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, how many wars, how many murders, how many misfortunes and horrors would that man have saved the human species, who, pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditches, should have cried to his fellows, 'Be sure not to listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong equally to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" A principal reason why Rousseau was such an idealist was that he rejected original sin. He held, as stated in an earlier lecture, that there is no original sin in the human heart. Political realism. A radical form of political realism maintains that wars between nations are unavoidable, since international politics is an amoral reality, that is, reality with no morality in it. So there's morality within nations, but between nations, how nations relate to each other, is not governed by any overarching morality. Regarding the Iraq War, St. John Paul II challenged this concept of war by asserting that, I quote, "War is never just another means that one can choose to employ for settling differences between nations. War cannot be decided upon, except as the very last option and in accordance with very strict conditions." End of quote. The founder of political realism was the German-born American Hans Morgenthau. According to Morgenthau, I quote, "The statesman must think in terms of the national interest conceived as power among other powers. The popular mind, unaware of the fine distinctions of the statesman's thinking, reasons more often than not in the simple moralistic and legalistic terms of absolute good and absolute evil. Is this approach to international politics problematic from a Catholic standpoint? Why or why not? According to Catholicism, certain actions are intrinsically evil, regardless whether they are done by an individual or by individuals in defense of a nation-state." In defining this supposedly realistic approach to international politics, Morgenthau wrote the following, I quote, "Realism maintains that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states. The individual may say for himself, 'Let justice be done, even if the world must perish,' but the state has no right to say so in the name of those who are in its care. While the individual has a moral right to sacrifice himself in defense of such a moral principle, the state has no right to let its moral disapprobation of the infringement of that moral principle get in the way of successful political action, itself inspired by the moral principle of national survival." End of quote. Types of wars. Political scientists have classified wars into various categories: total wars, where all nations are involved; wars that occur by accident; proxy wars, in which others fight on the behalf of a more dominant nation; biological wars; cyber wars, etc. From a Catholic standpoint, the most important question that distinguishes all wars, whatever their current classification, is whether it is just or not. As stated by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the justice of a war is determined by the following criteria, and I quote, "The strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy, at the same time. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospects of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. These are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war doctrine. The valuation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good." When stating the requirements of a just war, St. Thomas Aquinas similarly states, "In order for a war to be just, 3 things are necessary. First, the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged, for it is not the business of a private individual to declare war, because he can seek for redress of his rights from the tribunal of his superior. Moreover, it is not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, which has to be done in war. Secondly, a just cause is required, namely, that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Thirdly, it is necessary that the belligerents have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil." The above ways that we just discussed for discerning whether a war is just or not need to be supplemented with how to conduct a war justly. An important distinction exists between jus ad bellum, that is, going to war justly, and jus in bello, fighting in a war justly. It is possible to decide to wage a just war, but then when the war occurs not to fight with just means. Simply because some means may not be just within a war, though, does not necessarily mean that the war in its totality is an unjust war. God bless.